So my name is Abigail Bacon. I am the head of public services and outreach at the Cloud Library in Cincinnati. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm just going to give a quick introduction for Dr. Zierler and a few technical notes. Let's do technical stuff first. So as I mentioned, everybody's muted for now, but you'll be able to unmute yourself soon. This lecture is going to be recorded and it will be up on our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to that in a couple minutes. And lastly, if you have any technical questions, please just put them in the comments. And let's get started. So Wendy Zierler is the Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at HUC-JIR in New York. She received her PhD and her MA from Princeton University, her MFA in fiction writing from Sarah Lawrence College, and her BA from Stern College of Yeshiva University. In June 2021, she received rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva Maharat. Don't want to leave that. Her most recent book, Going Out with Knots, My Two Kaddish COVID Years with Hebrew Poetry, is forthcoming from the Jewish Publication Society. She's the author previously of Movies and Midrash, Popular Film and Jewish Religious Conversation from the SUNY Press, and it was a finalist for the National Book Award in Modern Jewish Thought and Experience in 2017. And she's author of And Rachel Stole the Idols, The Emergence of Hebrew Women's Writing from Wayne State, UP from 2004. I guess that's University Press. And many articles in the fields of Jewish literature and Jewish gender studies. In 2017, she was appointed the co-editor of Proof Texts, a journal of Jewish literary history, a leading scholarly journal in the field of Jewish literature. As a fiction writer, she has written short stories, as well as middle grade Jewish fantasy novels, one entitled The Return of Gerda Wertheimer. She's married to Daniel Veit and has 3 adult children. And we just want to thank Dr. Zierler again for this really exciting presentation. I've already gotten a preview of it, and I'm sure everybody will love it. And thank you so much for joining us today. And without further ado.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. So this past semester at HUC, I've had the opportunity to teach a brand new course on Jewish children's literature for my rabbinical students at HUC. And as part of this course, which has included Jewish children's Bibles, alphabet books, works of early Yiddish and Hebrew literature for children. I've also had a chance to delve into a few children's stories by S.Y. Agnon, by Shai Agnon. And so what I'm hoping to do for you today is to be able to get through 3 of these stories. The first one is called The Tale of Little Rabbi Gadiel. The second maybe is the best known of all of his stories, The Tale of the Goat, HaEz. And then third is called The Kerchief. So these are all by Shmuel Yosef Agnon, who was born Shmuel Yosef Chachkiz. He took on the name Agnon after immigrating to Palestine in 1908. His dates were 1888 to 1870, and Agnon remained to this day the only Hebrew Israeli writer who was ever given the Nobel Prize. Just a word of critical framing for you, and this will govern my approach to all of these stories. It's something of a commonplace in children's literary studies and the critical analysis of children's literature to talk about children's literature as employing a form of dual address. So what dual address refers to is that phenomenon in children's literature where a text moves between speaking to imagined child readers and imagined adult readers at the same time. Or when child and adult readers might understand the same passage differently based on their age-based knowledge or experience. Another way in which critics have framed this idea of dual address is Perry Nodelman's term, the hidden adult, which is a way of describing the way in which children's stories often move between these child and adult readers. And the idea being that within children's literature that seems focused on a child audience, that there always lurks behind this something that goes beyond juvenile expectations. The expectations or conventions or hoped for ideals that adults want kids to gain as a result of reading this children's literature. And all of this points to a sense of there's something larger, there's something larger beyond the small of children's literature, that there's a wider social or symbolic significance. And so we're going to be tracing that notion of dual address, or the hidden adult that is lurking behind the small, the representations of the child and the small in these stories by Agnon. I'm specifically going to be focusing with the first story on this idea of the Jewish Tom Thumb story. And I'll tell you in a sec what I mean by Tom Thumb for those of you who aren't familiar with that folk tale that dates back to the 17th century in England. I'm just letting you know that we're going to be looking at Agnon's Tom Thumb story, the story of Gadiel, the small Rabbi Gadiel, but it had a far-reaching influence on other writers, such as what you can see on this slide, a work by Agnon's friend, Chaim Nachman Bialik, who lived with Agnon in Germany in the 1920s. They lived nearby one another. And Bialik wrote his own version of the Hebrew Tom Thumb. It was called Etzba'oni, and Etzba being a finger, so like fingerling. And here you have a page from the illustrated version of Bialik's Etzba'oni that was published in Odessa in 1923. I should note that in addition to the goal of this, the literary thematic goal of this talk, which is to go through this material and see its wider significance, the other goal of this talk is to highlight some of the treasures of the Clow Library. And I only have this wonderful image from Bialik's Etzba'oni because when I was planning my course, librarians such as Abigail and others at the Clow Library were so helpful in mining the treasures of the library and sharing PDFs with me of these materials. And so this is just one page of this gorgeously illustrated Art Nouveau version of Bialik's Etzba'oni. Abigail, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, do you want to show us the screen share? Because we don't see the screen yet.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I haven't started that yet.
Thank you.
Thank you. So here's the screen share. So this is Bialik's, a page of Bialik's Etzba'oni. Here, this image of the flying, winged, tiny creature is Bialik's version of the Tom Thumb motif. You should know, though, that Bialik was not the first to do it. It was really Agnon's story of little Gadiel that furnished the Jewish model for this Hebrew Tom Thumb. Some of you in America might be more familiar with its later American iteration, that is Sadie Weilerstein's The Adventures of Ctonton, which was published in 1930. Many of us grew up with Ctonton stories. So Ctonton mined this tradition on the one hand of the English Tom Thumb, and on the other hand of Bialik's Etzba'oni. And if one does a close study, one can see where those various influences, thematic pieces of content come from. So let me just tell you a little bit about the history of Tom Thumb. Can I have a show of hands of anyone here on the Zoom call who's familiar with the story of Tom Thumb? Okay, great. So feel free to interject if there's something that you think that I'm missing. The Tom Thumb story is an Arthurian legend, so it's dating back to 1620. It's a legend that begins with the great magician Merlin, who was traveling around in the guise of a poor beggar. Does that sound familiar to you? A folktale figure who travels around in the guise of an old beggar, and he comes to a house and he meets these a virtuous plowman and his wife. They're poor but happy. Well, no, actually, that's not true. They're very hospitable, but he actually sees that there's an overarching sadness to them, and he wonders what is the reason for that sadness, and he finds out that it's because they lack children of their own. The woman cries and says she'd be the happiest person on earth if only she would have a child, and even if that child were no bigger than her husband's thumb, that would be okay with her. And that's exactly what Merlin gives her, a child who is no bigger than her husband's thumb, and his name is Tom. I would suggest because Tom and thumb are kind of sonically close to one another. And so indeed, this Tom thumb never grows any larger than his father's thumb, even as he gets older. But as he gets older, he becomes more cunning and adventurous and full of tricks. He also is always experiencing dangers and accidents. He gets tossed into a bag of cherry stones. He falls into a bowl of his mother's pudding. He gets swallowed by his mom's cow as she's busy milking the cow. And the only way he saves himself is by crying his way out of the cow's throat, like speaking from within the cow's throat. He goes on, has all these adventures. At one point, he gets swallowed by a giant named Gumbo. He also finds his way to King Arthur's court, which exposes him to yet more danger. At one point, he gets himself condemned to death. He also manages to gain great treasure for his parents. That's important. This idea of the thumb figure always very vulnerable to accidents, but through a combination of wiliness, gumption, manages to accomplish great things that greatly exceed his diminutiveness, his tiny stature. Eventually, sadly, he finds himself, after bringing treasure to his parents, and finds himself back in King Arthur's court, and gets the final danger that he experiences is that he perishes from the breath of a poisonous spider. Because that's what happens. If you're only as big as a thumb, you are vulnerable to that kind of danger. So that ending underscores that abiding vulnerableness, the sense of what's at stake in always being so tiny. So Agnon's the tale Ma'aseh Rabbi Gadiel HaTinok, the tale of little Rabbi Gadiel, is a Jewish version of this Tom Thumb story, and it draws heavily on this Arthurian tradition as well as Jewish traditions that laud and uphold the tiny, the small son. So here I'll enlist your participation. What's an example from our biblical tradition where being the smallest, being the one at home who is small and given special protection, and then demonstrates tremendous wiliness and cunning, even while being exposed to ongoing dangers? Does that remind you of anything in our tradition? Looks like Lawrence Edwards would like to contribute. You're unmuted, it seems. No, I don't see that you're muted, but I don't hear you.
King David.
Okay, right. So King David as the youngest of his family. Anyone else? This is actually an obsessive motif in the Bible, right? Where the youngest son is the youngest, the smallest son is the one who's granted the special favor or protection. I'm thinking, for example, of Jacob, right? The one who's identified with home and with the tent, and who sets out on a dangerous journey, and so on and so forth. So Rabbi Gadiel borrows on that biblical tradition, but it also builds specifically on Kabbalistic lore. Agnon himself referred to a source for the story of Rabbi Gadiel, the little Rabbi Gadiel, being from a book called Shulchan Aruch Shel Yitzchak Luria, which is a 17th century anonymously written work that tells the story of a protagonist named Rabbi Gadiel HaNa'ar, Rabbi Gadiel HaNa'ar, the boy. And that story tells of a young Torah prodigy who is martyred at a very small age, at the young age of 7. But nevertheless, despite this sad, tragic, worldly fate, he goes on to serve in paradise as the Rosh Yeshiva, as the head of the academy, of an academy called Heichal Kan Tzipor, the sanctuary of the bird's nest. So Agnon takes that combination of the Jewish traditional lauding of the youngest, smallest son, mixes it with Tom Thumb, mixes it further with this Kabbalistic book, Shulchan Aruch, of Luria, and tells his own story, which has an additional modern tint. He confessed, he wrote that in writing this story, that he had the 1913 Mendel-Bayless blood libel trial in mind when he wrote the story. So what Agnon does is he takes the Na'ar, the Rabbi Gadiel, the boy, HaNa'ar, and he transforms it into Rabbi Gadiel HaTinok, the baby, the super small. So he emphasizes how he wants to take this story and I guess enlarge the stakes by making the protagonist even smaller. And so what can I tell you about this Judaized Tom Thumb story? So here, unlike the Tom Thumb story that I told you, where you have a Merlin figure who I always associated with Elijah the prophet. And indeed, Elijah the prophet will show up at the end of the story of Rabbi Gadiel. In this version of the story, we don't have the husband and the wife who are pining for a child. The mom is completely written out of the story, which in itself is interesting. All of these stories by Agnon that are tracing a super small character's progress or development from being super small to something larger, all of them either excise the role of the mom or get rid of the role of the mom by the end, as if to say that the movement from being a katan, from being at the age of minority to something of the age of the majority, requires moving the child away from the realm of the mom, or what is construed as feminine. So I'll just throw that out for you there, and we'll examine that as we go. In this particular story, what we're told, here I've given you on the screen the opening line of the story. Rabbi Gadiel was born by virtue of the Torah, which his father taught the babes, the Tinokot of Yisrael, the Tinokot, the babes. And so here you see an interesting identification between the father who teaches Tinokot and the protagonist, who is called HaTinok, the babe. And when Rabbi Gadiel came out into the world, he was so small that one could hardly tell that he was human. What I've given you on the screen is the top above the title of the original printing of this story, which came out in 1920 in the United States in a Hebrew journal called Miklat, that I was able to actually pull off the shelves of the HUC library in New York. And here you have a picture that illustrates what we've described, that this child is born as if from the merit of his father teaching children, right? So we see that part of what this story is a very small figure's greatness on account of his Torah learning. But we also get a really interesting visual representation here of the vulnerability of the Jewish Tom Thumb figure. Here, what do we see? We see the little Gadiel sitting on the page of his father's Talmud. And in the story, after the manner of many Tom Thumb figure, the Tom Thumb legend, where the little one, this tiny fingerlet, is always given to dangers because he's so small, like he falls into the batter, he gets swallowed up by the cow. Here, he gets closed up into a book. His father doesn't even realize that he's there. He's so small, he's almost like the print on the page, that he gets shut into the book, which of course we fear, like, will he be suffocated? Will he be killed? Well, of course, for him, it's a great opportunity because he actually gets to live inside the book, as if to be absorbed by the book and absorb the book. And what we know about this Gadiel's greatness, despite his diminutiveness, is that in an absurd amount of time, starting with age 5, he learns the entire Torah. So that includes Bible, Mishnah, laws and legends, the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmuds, Midrash and Kabbalah, like the entire corpus. We aren't told exactly how long it takes, but the way in which it's recited, like one thing after another, in that short list makes it seem as though he manages to accomplish this in a small amount of time that would befit someone who's extraordinarily, miraculously small, right? So again, given like the Tom Thumb figure, he's given to these mishaps. He falls into a vial of oil around Hanukkah time. He gets closed into this book, and yet all of this redounds to his greatness. And it plays into what I would argue is the overarching significance of the Jewish Tom Thumb legend, which is to say that he doesn't just stand for himself, but or for the power of little ones, which is something that children always like to hear about, how powerful children can be. But it also speaks to the power of the people that he represents, that despite their being represented by the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, Jews, Yehudim, being represented by the smallest letter, that is the Yud, despite being an excruciatingly small minority, that they are given to these great attainments. So this is what happens to Rabbi Gadiel. His father trains him in Torah. He also takes him out into the world. Whenever he goes to the marketplace, his father folds him into a fold of his jacket, kind of like in his pocket, and he takes him that way, protected to market. And because he's secreted away like that, Rabbi Gadiel has this opportunity, this kind of surreptitious, covert opportunity to learn about the ways of the larger world. So from his secret hiding place, he learns all of the languages of the world and all of the ways and the kinds of knowledge that are there in the broader world. And that, plus his Torah knowledge, makes it possible for him to accomplish the major feat of heroism that the story documents. And that is the blood libel part of the story that I referred to. I said that Agnon reported that he had the Mendel Bayless blood libel trial of 1913 in mind when he wrote this story. What happens is that Rabbi Gadiel's father is considered the Gadol HaIr, the great one of the city. You see the interesting opposition here between super small and super large, that his father, who teaches babes, who merits this wonderful babe of a prodigy child because he teaches babes, he nevertheless is the great one of the community. That's somewhat fabulistic, given that the Melamed was not often the great leader of the community. It might be a fantasy about what Jewish learning can afford a person, at least Jewish learning to small children. It might be a fantasy of what children's literature can do and how it ought to be regarded with great merits, because in this case, the Melamed father who teaches babes is considered the great one in the town. But because the Jewish great one, I should say, because he's the Gadol HaIr, he's specifically targeted. He's resented by the Gentile authorities, by the Christians in town, and they plot against them. They plot against the entire community via Rabbi Gadiel's father, and they plan to bring down the family through a blood libel conspiracy. I thought it would be especially meaningful to look at this story with you in the lead up to Passover, since many of the blood libels were waged at this time of year, Passover time, because they centered around this idea of Jews drinking the blood of a slaughtered Gentile boy or Gentile with the wine on Passover, or instead of the wine on Passover. In this particular case, the local priest has this idea that they will burst in on Rabbi Gadiel's family and substitute the wine in the Elijah's cup with blood, and thereby charge the family and the entire community with a blood libel. When the Christians come to the house, Rabbi Gadiel and everybody, they're so frightened. What Rabbi Gadiel, super, super small, does is he jumps into the Elijah cup to hide. And no, in so doing, doesn't realize that part of the plot is that the priest is going to drink the wine in that cup so as to substitute it. So what do you think happens to Rabbi Gadiel? After the manner of these various Tom Thumb stories, feel free to unmute if we can get this going properly. What do we think is going to happen to poor Rabbi Gadiel? I'm so desperately trying to enlist you to. Okay, so what happens to Rabbi Gadiel is that he gets drunk down into the belly of this evil priest. So that, of course, reminds us of another famous story of someone smaller being in the belly of something very, very large, namely the Jonah story. Jonah, but unlike Jonah, who prays from the belly of the whale, right? Who recites Hebrew and invokes God's name from the belly of this great fish. Rabbi Gadiel doesn't like the idea of pronouncing anything holy in the belly, in the intestines of this profane, evil priest. And so instead, he uses all of that great knowledge that he had gleaned when he went to the market. And he spends his time while in the belly of the priest reciting all of the, reflecting on all of the seven wisdoms, So that would be the seven wisdoms from medieval times were mathematics, engineering, music, astronomy, natural sciences, theology, and philosophy. That's a lot of learning, a lot of secular learning in addition to all the Torah that he knew, and speaking the 70 tongues of the 70 nations of the world. So he's busying himself while he's spending his time in that vulgar, debased place. When it comes time for the priest to try and bring charges against his father and against the Jewish community, since Rabbi Gadiel, like Tom Thumb, was in the gullet, in the stomach, and then the throat of the priest, he uses that opportunity to speak from the throat of the priest and to denounce him and to expose his plot so that the priest is executed. The problem, of course, is that Rabbi Gadiel is still in the belly of that priest, which effectively means, even though he manages to save his people, he himself is sacrificed. So he is in this case, a Gadiel. He is the kid of God, or the Lamb of God. This should remind you of two things. Oh, well, maybe three from the Passover story. So when we think of a Gadi or a Gadia, right? We think of the kid from Chad Gadia, right? Who is killed in the succession of things that get killed until finally there is a divine reckoning and a straightening, an end to the violence. So that's one thing. The other is the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice. But then, of course, in the Christian supersessionist context, the way in which Jesus, as the Lamb of God, the Gadiel, claims to die for the sins of the world. And here, this story basically tries to take that back and claim the primacy of Jewish suffering over that supposedly salvific suffering of Jesus. But lest we end on that very tragic note, what happens, and here it's important because the Merlin guy in the story shows up only at the end, Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, whose cup we had mentioned previously, he rescues Rabbi Gadiel from the corpse of the executed priest and anoints him in pure olive oil so that he should not be sullied. He basically performs a purification on him. He immerses him into flowing streams of perfume. He dresses him in a gown of light and leads him to one of the caves of the just in paradise, where he can sit with Elijah, like the Rabbi Gadiel HaNa'ar from the Kabbalistic text. He can sit forever in paradise with Elijah and study Torah, specifically the Torah of the persecution and the punishment of the wicked. The prosecution and punishment of the wicked. And so he kind of sits eternally on guard as the figure who is going to punish all of those yet to be punished oppressors of the Jews. So smallness is marshaled on a number of levels in this story, both in terms of the way it invokes prior literary traditions, Jewish and Gentile about smallness, but also physically in the way in which the story was presented. And here I have several images that were provided to me by Abigail Bacon, who's here on this call, one of our cloud librarians, of a later printing. I showed you an image from the 1920 printing of Rabbi Gadiel in a journal called Miklat, in a periodical. Here it was published as a book in 1925, and not just a book, as like a nutshell book, a super tiny book. And Abigail, I'll invite you if you can to pick up the book. Okay, so a super small book. Here you have an image of the cover or the spine of the book. It was printed in a relatively small print run, for at least for Agnon's books, in this tiny format, where you only had 12 or 13 lines on a page. And so its nutshell format is meant to supplement the tininess of the character and the motif of smallness, and show how, despite it being something super small, it can have larger adult significance. I will note that the end of the story, or this should say tale, so ends the tale of little Rabbi Gadiel, but unended is the story. I'll read it to you in Hebrew, the final line. Tam ma'aser Rabbi Gadiel HaTinok velo tamu ma'asav. The final line of the story, which comes after describing how he's in this paradise, sitting next to Elijah the prophet, waiting and studying to be able to bring about the final justice. We find out that this part of his story is over, is tam, is whole and complete. Velo tamu ma'asav, but his deeds, deeds of this mythical Rabbi Gadiel, they're so big that they're not ended. I would suggest that the word tamu here, one way we translate it, and the way it's translated in the published version of the English story, the English published version of the story, is unended. But since the word tam is a multivalent word in the Hebrew language, tam doesn't just mean tam v'nishlam, something is over, but it also means whole, unblemished, like a pure sacrifice, like the way in which Yaakov in the Bible was referred to as an ish tam, yoshev oalim, a whole unblemished person who sat in tents. That it's suggesting that while the story is over, it may not be an entirely innocent story. His story is not completely tam, insofar as in order to accomplish his great feats, despite his tininess, he has to descend into a very uninnocent place, a very dirty, like by definition, scatological place. He really has to immerse himself in the muck of the world in order to effect a change. It's not an innocent story. Being so small and vulnerable means that you're going to get blemished and bruised by the world. And so I'm going to want us to follow that a little bit. The way in which these stories figure the smallness as something that is sacrificed, but may get unblemished in the process of its sacrifice, and perhaps getting unblemished is part of the message that Agnon wants to get out, that we can't remain unsullied or unblemished or secreted away in our tents if we want to actually have an effect on the modern world. Okay, so that's Rabbi Gadiel. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to the next story? Are we good? Thumbs up?
I just want to point out, this printed version that we have doesn't end that way.
It doesn't end that way? How does it?
It has like just a whole paragraph ending, kind of talking about how Rabbi Gadiel comes back and it's his job to kind of frighten everybody into repentance. But it just ends with a completely different line.
Okay, so you'll have to send me that version so that I can.
Will do.
You send me those images, but I actually don't have that.
Yeah, no, now I regret having not scanned for you the entire thing.
Okay, well, I look forward to it. Actually, this idea of the difference between versions of stories, Agnon obsessively rewrote. And many of his stories have different versions, but you'll see in this particular talk that sometimes he pitches the endings differently depending on whether he's pitching the story for children or he's pitching it for adults. Yes, Lawrence, what would you like to ask? Can you unmute him, Abigail?
There we go. Now we can, but I think Jason had his hand up first.
Oh, okay. I'll take whoever would like to come. Jason? Well,
Can you unmute me?
yeah, you're
There you
unmuted.
are.
Wonderful. I wonder if you can go back to the dual audience for just 1 second and talk about how the story was used by parents when it was printed in the HaMitpahat. Did you sit and read the story to your child, or was this for an adult to read and then sort of retell to a child?
So in HaMitpahat, there's no indication that it's being specifically pitched for a child. If anything, I think that this story of Rabbi Gadiel participates in the kind of convention of literature that preceded specifically designated children's literature. That's one of the things that we traced in my course, that the idea of children's literature is a relatively modern phenomenon. Like you had to actually conceive of the child as an entity apart from adults, and that's a relative, as being something other than like little adults. And that's a relatively modern phenomenon. And so most of what was read to children in earlier days were folk tales, and they were read to children and adults alike. And so the dual address of Rabbi Gadiel is that kind of primary dual address stemming, I would argue, from the folktale tradition. The only difference that I see between what might be considered more childlike in the Miklat printing and this story is that it included that illustration at the top. Whereas other pieces in that volume of Miklat weren't necessarily given any illustrations at all. But we'll see more explicitly in the case of the next story where Agnon will write the same story, but print it differently for adults and children, and will himself use it as an occasion to read to his own grandchildren. With the tiniest difference in the ending being excruciatingly important for what is being given over by both in both versions of the story. I hope that answered your question, but I don't see you anymore. Lawrence.
I just wanted to ask about the Shulchan Aruch of
Yitzhak Luria.
of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria. Is that a real book?
Yeah, it's a real,
because
it's a real
okay.
from the 17th century of a Kabbalistic tale.
Okay, because I understand that sometimes Agnon kind of invents his sources.
This source he talked about in correspondence with Gershom Scholem, the great scholar. So it was a real source, and it came to him in a kind of vision that this could work for him for his right. But it's also clear that he was drawing from a general European, there is the Arthurian version of Tom Thumb. There's also a Grimm's version of Tom Thumb, and Agnon did have access. He was living in Germany at the time that he wrote this story. I'll just say biographically, Agnon was born in Galicia in a town called Buchach. He immigrated to Palestine as when he was younger than 20, so he himself was a Katan. He left Palestine in 1912 and lived in Germany for 12 years. So in 1920, he was still living in Germany. At that time, he's becoming friends with the likes of Gershom Scholem and also his patron, Zalman Shoken of Shoken Books.
And Martin Buber also.
Martin Buber, right. And we'll see the Shokens, the patronage of the Shokens is a subject in this talk too. So we'll get to that in a bit. All right, so the next story that I want to look at is a story that I imagine some of you are familiar with. I know that I read it when I was a kid in school. It was published in 1925 in two separate versions. One in a book called Pauline, part of a series of legends. Agnon created or adapted folk tales from Poland. And that was the adult version. At the very same time, it was published here in this series called Sipurim Tziurim LeTinokot, for babes. So we have the Tinok thing again. Tinok being the way of Agnon's way of cueing the child theme or the child audience. And in this case, it's a fully illustrated version of the story. The version for adults has a different title. It's called Pi HaMe'ara o Mahaseh HaEz, the mouth of the cave or the tail of the goat, whereas the children's version is just called Maaseh HaEz. The children's version was illustrated by none other than Zev Rabban. Are any of you familiar with that name, Zev Rabban? So Zev Rabban, who was born Wolf Rawicki in Poland. So you can see how his Polish provenance might also play a role in him having been chosen to be the illustrator, but that's not the only reason. He was born in Poland and he studied sculpture and architecture before moving to Palestine, where he fell under the influence of Boris Schatz, who was the founder of the Bezalel Art Academy. There at Bezalel, he continued his studies. He also went on to be a celebrated faculty member. Rabban is best known for two things. Number one, these illustrated tourist posters for Come to Palestine. And on the other hand, for fabulous illustrations of biblical books, including Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, which is a biblical source text for Maaseh HaEz. It's profusely alluded to in the story. So Jason had asked earlier about this idea of separating, of dual address and separating out what stories might be for children and what might be for adults. As I mentioned, in folktale tradition, oh, you're wonderful. This is a Zev Rabban illustration. Beautiful. Thank you so much. So much of the fantasy literature that we have from the pre-modern period comes to us from fairy tales, from folk tales that were not specifically written for children, right? And so Agnon, in writing this story, he puts into practice this awareness of the folktale origin of children's literature, and in basing the story on two prior legends, two prior Jewish folktales. One source comes from the Talmud, from Tractate Bava Kama 79b. It's a story about a pious Hasid, and here we're not talking Hasid as in, you know, the Ukrainian modern movement that was founded by the Baal Shem Tov. No, it's Hasid as a term to refer to someone of exemplary piety. So in this story, there was a Hasid, a super pious man who, despite his Hasidut being so pious, he was stricken with illness. It's described that he was goneach melibo, that he was groaning from his heart. And that's a way of referring to some sort of heart ailment or some sort of chronic illness. And he's prescribed by the doctors, in order to deal with this groan from his heart, this chronic ailment, to drink fresh milk every day, a fresh goat's milk. Now, the problem is, at that time, there was a prohibition against owning behemot dakot, small farm animals such as goats, because if they were left to graze, they would go and graze on other people's land. And so in Eretz Yisrael, in order to prevent depredation of lands, you weren't allowed to keep goats. You could only have them outside of the bounds of the land of Israel in places like Syria. So what is he going to do? He needs this fresh milk. He has to have it fresh out of the goat. Roteach, like as if boiling, like hot from the animal. And maybe this was our pre-awareness that like there was no pasteurization, so you better get it fresh before it goes bad on you. But in any event, the only way that he can take his medicine is to bring the goat inside and tie the goat to his bed. When his friends come to visit him, they're taken aback, like they jump back in horror that there is a goat, that there is a thief. That's the way in which the friends referred to the goat, because goats were considered thieving animals, that there was a thief in the house of this pious man. And it was like a blot on his spiritual record. And yet later they discover that it's the only sin he ever committed. So it's an exemplum. It's a way of referring to, explaining what exemplary piety might be. The only sin he ever committed is that he kept a goat, which after all, he kept for medicinal purposes. Okay, so this is one basis for Agnon's story, which starts identically, almost identically. Here, the Gemara starts with Maaseh bechasid hagonech melibo. Here is a story about an exemplary pious man who is groaning from his heart, and Agnon's story starts with Maaseh bezaken, an elderly man who was groaning from his heart. Now, the other source for Agnon's Maaseh HaEz, the tale of a goat, is a story that was collected in Dov Noy's famous collection of Jewish folk tales. It's called Two She-Goats from Shebrashin. It's a Polish folk tale, and it's about a poor chassid, in this case, chassid as in chassidut, chassidism, who has two she-goats. But these she-goats don't actually give much milk. I mean, this man and his wife, this chassid and his wife, they're really eking it out. One day, the chassid's wife forgets to tie up the goats, and they go missing. And they wonder where the goats are. When they finally return, their udders are filled with this special kind of milk, of the sort that they'd never seen before. They're so full and the milk is so extraordinary. It's not just regular milk, it's milk that can feed and heal the entire town. So the wife and the husband, they figure, well, this must be from God. And so the wife once again leaves them untied and lets them roam. And the same thing happens. They come back with this remarkable full load of exceptional milk. And so the chassid is wondering, like, where are they going? That they have this special milk. And he decides what he's going to do is follow these goats to see where they go. And he follows them into a forest and then into a cave. And this is a cave that's filled with all kinds of dangers, falling rocks and enchantments, like treasures, temptations, sexually lurid things. But the chassid, he's pious. He keeps his eyes like on the prize. He doesn't relent. He doesn't give in to the temptations. He finally makes it out of the cave. And where does he find himself? Of course, for those of you who have read the Agnon story and you get like the drift of where this is going, where does he find himself? In the land of Israel. And he's so amazed that he's like managed to get from Poland to Israel that he wants to send a letter to his wife and to all the townspeople of Shebrashin, come and join me. And so what does he do? He writes a letter telling them to follow the goats back through the cave. He rolls up this letter in a fig leaf, ties it around the neck of one of the goats, and sends them back. Except the wife, the implication is she's a bit of a dolt. She doesn't look. She doesn't see the letter. She despairs that he hasn't returned, and she decides, what do I need these goats for? What do I need to live by myself outside of town? And what am I going to do with goats in town? And so she sends the goats off to slaughter and only discovers the letter from her husband in Eretz Yisrael after the goats were slaughtered. And then contacts the rabbi of the town, and the rabbi mourns and she mourns and everybody mourns that they've missed this opportunity, this miraculous opportunity that will never return again to move to Palestine. And they keep the letter for a while as a reminder of that missed opportunity, but then the letter burns and that's that, right? So it's an exemplum of that missed opportunity. So now you see the basis of Agnon's story. Agnon's story begins with, there was an old man who was groaning from his heart, and he was told that he should drink milk. And so he gets an HaEz, he gets a goat, who is given to the same kind of disappearing act, where the goat returns with this milk that is the most wonderful, healing, delicious milk of all time. But the disappearing act recurs. In this case, unlike the Shebrashin folktale, where the chassid comes up with the idea on his own to go after the missing goats, here the story is changed. There's no wife, like We have to dispatch the women in order to tell these stories about moving from a small worldview to a larger worldview, shall we say. And it's a story about an old man and his son. And it's the son who comes up with this idea and says, you know what, I have an idea. I'll go and tie what he calls a mishicha, which is a very obscure Mishnaic word for rope or cord. How would, if those of you who know modern Hebrew, how would one in modern Hebrew say rope? Not mishicha, I promise you. You'd use a word like chevel, or you might use the word chut if you want it to be more like a thread. The word mishicha is an arcane usage. Of course, Agnon is very canny in his usage. The son has this idea of tying a mishicha around the tail of the goat. So as soon as the goat moves, wags its tail, the son will know to get up and follow. Now, why does he choose the name mishicha? And it will tell us something about what Agnon is doing in transforming these prior tales that I mentioned. What does mishicha sound like? And here you, come on, guys, I really got to get you to talk. What does mishicha sound like? Abigail?
I'll jump in there, like Mashiach or Messiah.
Exactly. So, but rather than waiting for Messiah, like the old man is wont to do in his passive stance, after all, it's not he who has the idea of how to go and figure out where this goat goes, it's the son. So rather than wait for Messiah to bring redemption, here the young boy himself is going to take the matter in his own hands. And he's going to, in a sense, detach himself from the old ways of his Zaken father. It's important that he's called a Zaken and not a Chassid. He stands for the old, whereas his son stands for the young. The father stands for the large, prevailing, perhaps majority view in their shtetl, whereas the son is this small, right? This principle of the small that's going to venture out. And perform this act of activism. Now, he will, like the Polish story, he follows the goat into a cave. Unlike the Polish story, we don't have descriptions of temptations and torments and riches, just getting in and out of the cave, which suggests something about the story's worldview, about the journey, that it's not so difficult a journey. It's something that can be performed, you know, on this earth. He goes through the cave, and where does he find himself at the end? He finds himself in Tzfat, miraculously finds himself in the city of Tzfat, in a landscape that's described with profuse allusions to the landscape of Song of Songs. So it's like walking into the Zev Rabban illustration of Song of Songs. And he discovers soon that Shabbat is about to enter. So because Shabbat is about to come, he doesn't have time to go back to his father to tell him where he's been. And so he too decides he's going to send a letter back. He grinds up his own ink out of a plant. He writes a letter and he sticks it into the goat's ear and sends the goat back. And he figures that the father who loves this goat will make nice, you know, will caress the goat's head. The goat will wiggle its ear, and the letter will fall out. And that's how the father will know where he is and be able to follow him to Eretz Yisrael and be at the source of where the super milk comes from. But the father doesn't do that. The father doesn't see his son and therefore despairs. And he starts to wail in the language that is reminiscent of Jacob lamenting Joseph, and in the language that's reminiscent of David lamenting Absalom. Now, why would that be important? That he speaks, he ventriloquizes like Jacob. He is using Jacob's exact words, and he's also using David's exact words. I'll just say, Lawrence, that you referred to David being the Katan, and I mentioned Jacob being the Katan. So bear that in mind for a moment. But what do we know when Jacob laments Joseph? His sons bring him the bloodied coat of many colors, and he laments Joseph. What's the problem with that? My son is dead. I'd like to go down to hell, to Sheol with him. What is the crucial error on Jacob's part at that moment?
Everybody can unmute themselves. I've allowed that and requested unmuting, but if nobody's got an answer, I'll pop in, pipe in.
Please pop in.
Okay, well, we know at the time that Joseph is actually very much alive.
Okay, so number one, accuse us that the father doesn't know he's mistaken. His son isn't dead. And it's only because he thinks his son is dead, he's going to do what he's about to do. Now, what about David and Absalom? For those of you who know the story of David and Absalom, Absalom dies and David laments him. But what had happened before that? Which makes David's lamenting kind of crazy.
He was trying to depose David.
He was trying to kill him, right? So Agnon smuggles in via that illusion. And here is the dual address, right? The hidden adult reading the story sees those illusions and sees their implication about the mistaken orientation of the father. But also, in the case of the David and Absalom reference, the potential for us to understand that the son is a rebel. The son was trying to help out his father, true, by finding out where the goat goes. But on the other hand, it may very well be that the son is trying to get away from his father and his old world ways and his constant kvetching and his passive mode. And he's using this as a very ready opportunity to get his way through that cave and off to Palestine, which would be a representation of what? Given what we know about Agnon, having grown up in Galicia, but as a 19-year-old, going off himself to Palestine. It turns the story into a story of a major rift between the world of the old and the large majority, and of the small and the Zionist activist minority, those who felt that it was time to stop waiting for Mashiach to come and to take the Mishicha into your own hands and determine the Jewish fate that way. So the implication of this story is that the father is in part to blame for his situation, that he was too stuck in his old ways, his grown-up ways. I will note that there is a pronounced difference. I mean, it's only one line, and yet it has a huge effect between the way the story ends in its Pauline adult version and the way it ends in its version for children. So in the adult version, the final two lines are as follows. Since then, I skipped a crucial part. When the goat comes back and the father doesn't get the letter, he immediately despairs, apropos of what I mentioned before, and he sends the goat to be slaughtered by the shochet. And it's only after he has the goat slaughtered that he sees the letter, that it falls out, and he realized that he's missed his opportunity. And he groans and he wails, "Oh, oi, oi for me." And from that moment, the story says, the mouth of the cave, Pi HaMe'ara, has been hidden from the eye, and there's no longer a shortcut. And that boy, in other words, the boy that went off to Palestine, if he has not died, he shall bear fruit. He shall bear fruit even in his old age, full of sap and richness. This is a reference, an allusion to Psalm 92, which is read as part of Kabbalat Shabbat, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, calm and peaceful in the land of the living. That last bolded line, in the Hebrew, it's Im adayin lo met, ve'oto bachur im adayin lo met, od yanuv b'seva dashen v'ra'anan b'artzot ha'chaim shaket v'shanan. That bolded part here does not appear in the children's version. It only appears in the adult version. And now what is the implication? What's at stake in that adult-centered version of the story? What does it mean to say, and that boy, if he has not died? I've already suggested to you that one way to read the story is a critique of the old world. Im lo met. Why are we thinking that he might die? What is that implying? Anybody have any ideas? What might someone What might someone die from in Palestine in the early 20th century? The story is written as if it's a folktale, and yet it was published in 1925, and so we know the realities of life in Palestine in the 1920s. Like no one knew the realities of life in Palestine in the teens. What might someone die from in Palestine in the 1920s? You might die from malaria. You might die from Arab attacks. You might die from financial hardships. And so the story is subtly alluding to the fact that, number one, things were really tough in Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't the tourist poster that the Zev Rabban illustration would suggest, number one. So that's a bit of honesty that's not there in the children's story. That's kind of the adult point of view. The other thing is, if he didn't die, he's a fat cat. He's living full of sap and richness, calm and peaceful in the land of the living. Now, what might be the implication of that? And why would it be so dangerous to say that in a children's book?
Maybe because you don't want your children to run off and leave you.
Right. It's suggesting that that these Zionists were running off and leaving their parents behind. And they're perfectly happy living far away from their parents and their grandparents. And they've detached themselves from the old ways of their fathers. They've left the religiosity. And so this story, this simple seeming folktale that's often taught to little kids without much complexity, it is leveling a critique in two different directions at the same time, both against the passivity and the quiescence of old world Jews and against the ready disconnection from the old world and from parents, the lack of kibud ava'en, the lack of honoring parents and grandparents that's implicit in the Zionist project. Now, I just wanted to share with you, if you guys are up to it, my proof that Agnon meant this as a children's story, this ending specifically as the children's story, because he himself was recorded as reading it to his own grandchildren as a bedtime story without that ending. I'm going to see if I can, I tried to cue it up to the very ending part, but I know I'm going to have to, excuse me, I'm going to move it to the very end. And you'll hear Agnon's voice.
סמוי פי המערה מן העין ודאר קצרה עוד עין. ילדים טובים, ליל מנוחה, והמלאך הרואה. טוב, קריאת שמע. אל מלך נאמן, שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד, ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד.
Okay, so here you hear Agnon reading the story with that ending, which does not include the line about the son, if he didn't die, he's happy fat cat, just until the end where the cave is forever closed and there's no way to go there anymore. So it's supporting the Zionist reading that it's good that we're here in Eretz Yisrael, but it's not supporting this idea that in order to be a Zionist, you have to separate from tradition or separate from your elders, from that larger, older world. And that's only emphasized further by it being followed by Agnon's saying Shema with his grandchildren. Right, that the continuity between the generations, between grandparents and grandchildren, is being maintained in Eretz Yisrael. In the children's version, however, we do see a very clear illustrated representation of old and young, of large and small. This is the little boy. He's older than I would have expected when I'm imagining someone going off on such a dangerous journey. So this is the Zaken and his son and their goat at the beginning of the story. This is the Zaken finally reading the letter after the Shochet. This is the Shochet holding on to the head of the goat, the sacrificed goat. Here, the salvation seems to entail having, once again, to martyr a goat a Gadi, we can say the Gadi of Zionism. Something has to be sacrificed for the salvation to occur. And here, these old people, they're just stuck in their ways, lamenting that they didn't actualize their choice and that this sacrifice had to happen. Everybody with me? Okay. The last story that I want us to look at takes us, we had a story that was written when Agnon was in Germany. HaEz was published a year after Agnon returned to Palestine. And so you could also see how the Zionist content of the story about getting through the cave is representing his own experience biographically, that he had been in the old world and extricated himself finally and settled for the second time in Palestine, whereas in the early in his early first aliyah, he lived in the Neve Tzedek in Yafo, Tel Aviv. He's now living in Jerusalem. That's HaEz. Now we're in 1933, and we're looking at a story called HaMitpahat, the kerchief, which is a story that Agnon wrote as a bar mitzvah gift for Gideon Shoken, who was the son of Zalman Shoken, his patron of Shoken books. Agnon met Shoken when he was living in Germany in the teens. Shoken was instrumental in guiding him in European literary reading, in getting him books, and then eventually providing an outlet for the rest of his life for him to publish. Agnon would publish regularly in HaEz, and all of his books were published by Shoken Press. This story was written, like I said, as a gift for the 13th birthday of Gideon Shoken, who went on, the family at the time was still living in Germany, but it managed to escape. The family managed to escape Germany they immigrated to Palestine in 1934 and went on to become the owners of HaEz, the newspaper. So to this day, the Shoken family owns this publishing company and is a very important voice in public and literary culture in Israel. The book was, as in the case of Rabbi Gadiel, the shape and size, the paratextual quality of the book is just as important as the content. So it was published for this occasion in 13 copies for the 13th birthday. Each page has only 13 lines exactly. So counted here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. This is the dedication page of HaMitpahat, which says the book of the kerchief by Shmuel Yosef Agnon, for my friend, the son of my friend, Habachur, the bar mitzvah boy Gideon, the son of Shlomo Shoken, who will grow up b'Torah u'mitzvot, in Torah and good deeds and ma'asim tovim, and it refers to his bar mitzvah and the date of his bar mitzvah, which was on the 6th of Tevet, Tartzab, so 1933, January 1933. And now the book is not quite as diminutive as Rabbi Gadiel, where I really believe that size of the book is meant to mirror the super tininess. That sounds oxymoronic, like the great tininess, but the exemplary tininess of this thumbling character. It's not that small, but it's pretty small. And it is meant, the story is not just 13 lines a page for a 13-year-old, but it's also divided into 13 chapters. And as such, it tracks the progress of the narrator, the first person narrator from his childhood, from his earlier childhood to entering into an age of majority. So from the small to the large, from the personal to the public. The story, I keep on referring to this principle of dual address, that it is addressing both the kid, in this case, the bar mitzvah boy. It's Agnon's like bar mitzvah speech for this bar mitzvah boy, as if. So it's addressed to the child, but it's also addressed to his parents. And it is reflecting a child's point of view, but it's also reflecting an adult perspective. So it's an adult looking back on his childhood. And so we see this double narrative perspective throughout the story. And how do we see that? Throughout the story, as the narrator is talking about his own childhood, he refers to his father as Abba Zichrono Livracha, my father of blessed memory, and his mother, Ima Aleha Hashalom, my mother, peace upon her. Now, when do we use those phrases, Zichrono Livracha and Aleha Shalom? Nora. Lawrence. You can't unmute? Nomi, do you have an idea? When do we say
Met. They're dead. They've died.
right? So this is a boy, an adult reflecting on his life as a boy at a remove, now that his parents are only gone, are already gone. And so you see this nostalgic dual address. And I would suggest that the sense of nostalgia is further evoked in the story via the image of the kerchief. So this is a story about a boy whose father often goes away for business. And when his father goes away from business, he kind of has to act the part of the adult in the house, and he likes to sleep in his father's bed. I mean, that sounds super Oedipal, which of course it is. He tries to stretch himself out in the bed to see if he can occupy the space. We'll talk about that more in a second. But what the father does when he goes away on business is he brings back gifts. The narrator is always very excited when the father brings home the gifts. Interestingly enough, it's not one of the gifts for the children that's the focus of the story, rather a gift for the mother, which is a kerchief. The kerchief is this legendary, exemplary suit. We can call it a chassid of a kerchief, right? A mark of extreme piety. It seems to never get dirty and never need to be washed. It's a symbol of the home and of the love between the father and the mother and everything of that old world before the disruptions and the disillusionments that come with adulthood. And one of the ways in which we see the fact that this is a dual address, reflecting the point of view of a kid, albeit filtered through the perspective of an adult, is the way in which the kerchief is described. Now, I looked around on the internet for images that could best illustrate what this kerchief looked like. I didn't quite get it right, but it's referred to as a reversible flowered scarf that had checks on it. And on one, it was reversible in that on one side it was brown and white, on the other side it was white and brown. Now, those of you who are connoisseurs of women's fashion and beautiful, decorative, ornamental objects, even if brown is a color that you really like, and I happen to like brown a lot, if you would choose a color scheme for a kerchief that would be especially beautiful, would you choose brown and white?
Not likely.
Not likely. You might choose like something pink or red, or if it has flowers, that it would have the green of the leaves and a different color for the petals. You wouldn't choose brown and white. So Agnon is choosing brown and white for a very specific reason, and the hidden adult is aware of that, of the meaning of that reason. What artifact that represents the past comes to us in the form of brown and white? It used to be brown and white. Nowadays, it may be black and white. What is brown and white? Think about your family, treasures of your familial past. Whatever you have that pictures of people from the old country or previous generations. How do they look?
Brown and white photographs.
Yes. Specifically sepia.
Yeah.
So when we think of sepia, sepia stands for a nostalgic look back. it's a visual presentation that doesn't even exist really anymore for us. So it very much is a visual representation of nostalgia. And so the story is nostalgic about a world that's been lost. And in the same way that HaEz looks in both directions, right? It tries to show some love and deference to the past and cast criticism against those who entirely disconnect from the past. Agnon, for a while, had left observance, but then he became an observant man again when he returned to Israel in 1924. So he was not about disconnecting entirely and radically from the past. He was about taking that past into the future. So there's a reverence for the sepia, but the sepia is insufficient. It's not going to be enough. Because those things are dead, and one has to live beyond the death. So this silk brocaded kerchief adorned with flowers and blossoms is this representation of the Father's great love, the Father of blessed memory's great love for the mother, peace be her. But it's going to have a particular career in this story. Agnon makes a point of talking about how miraculous this kerchief was. But when someone mentions that pristine quality, that something's going to happen to this kerchief, right? It's not going to remain pristine forever. Now we get an anticipation of what's going to happen with this kerchief. Earlier on in the story, when the boy is sleeping in his father's bed and he's fantasizing about being an adult, and he's filtering his fantasies through a Talmudic legend. This is like a beautiful picture of a kid who imagines superheroes from the Talmud. And the superhero that he imagines is Messiah, is Mashiach. And he'd been taught the story that comes to us via Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and a conversation that Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi has with the prophet Eliyahu Navi. You see the connection, kind of the thread that I'm drawing here of Elijah the prophet references. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi wants to know when the Messiah will come, and Eliyahu Navi, who is supposed to be the harbinger of Messiah, says to him, go ask him yourself. And then Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, well, where is he sitting for me to ask him? Elijah says at the entrance of the city of Rome, where he is sitting with all of the lepers and the beggars. And so Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi asks, well, how will I know the difference between him and all the other lepers and beggars? And the answer that's given is that, well, whereas all the other lepers and beggars untie their bandages all at once and then replace them, the Messiah, who's always on the ready, he only unties one bandage at a time. So the young narrator of this story, let's call him, an alter ego of a young Shmuel Yosef Chachkes, he is meditating on this story, and has a dream about seeing the Messiah in all of his festering sores. And he's so disgusted by the look of these sores that he has to avert his eyes. He can't look. And as a result, he's almost thrown against a mountain with all kinds of swarming dangerous creatures. And only at the last second in his dream does his father sweep him up in his talus and save him. We get an early sense of the boy's mindset and development and his narcissism in the way he responds to this leper, and also the way he paraphrases and adapts various other Talmudic stories that he's learned, all from a very self-centered point of view. And so the progress of the story has to go from the self and the small-mindedness to a larger view of a gadol, from being a katan in terms of mitzvot to being a gadol, someone in the age of majority in terms of mitzvot, because that's what bar mitzvah is, going and attaining that sense of responsibility that comes with the age of majority. And so the narrator, like in a moment of Maimonidean repentance, tshuva, is put back in the same situation he had been before to try and redo it and do it better, to not commit the same sin of averting his eyes. On the day of his bar mitzvah, his mother takes this beautiful, pristine kerchief that had always been a symbol of purity and piety and love between the mother and the father, and her own observance of mitzvot, her own modesty. She takes it off and she ties it around her son's neck so that he should wear it when he goes to shul, when he's called to the Torah for the first time for an aliyah at his bar mitzvah. It's a kind of act of binding him to her love object, binding him to her. But I mentioned that the women kind of need to be dispatched in these stories. They belong to the world of the small. They can never really attain an age of halachic majority in that world. And so the boy on his way back from shul, from having had his bar mitzvah, he sees a real life version of that beggar that he had seen in his dream, that's based on the Gemara from Sanhedrin. And seeing this beggar's poor festering sores, he takes the kerchief off of his neck and hands it to the beggar so that the beggar can tie his sores with it. That moment in the story occurs at the end of the 12th chapter, and right before the 13th chapter. So it's like the mitzvah project moment of the story. It's taking an awareness of an age of majority and putting it into practice in the world. It's taking a domestic token and turning it into a tool that actually can save the world. And it's presented in the story as a revelatory moment, almost like Sinai. Well, almost like the way they talk about eclipses, that everything goes silent and something revelatory happens. And he looks upon this and he has the equivalent of an epiphany. And he fears. So this is the Hebrew version in the actual book that was given out at the bar mitzvah to Gideon Shokin and to the other guests. This is the way it's translated. The sun stopped still in the sky, not a creature was to be seen in the street, but he, that is God, in his mercy sat in heaven and looked down upon the earth and let his light shine bright on the sores of the beggar. I began loosening my kerchief to breathe more freely, for tears stood in my throat. Before I could loosen it, my heart began racing in strong emotion, and the sweetness which I had already felt doubled and redoubled. I took off, doubled and redoubled, right? So it gets bigger and bigger, large. I took off the kerchief and I gave it to the beggar. He took it and wound it around his sores. The sun came and stroked my neck. I looked around. There was not a creature in the market, but a pile of stones lay there and reflected the sun's light. For a little while, I stood there without thinking. Then I moved my feet and I returned home. Now, of course, what is the problem with this moment? His mother had given him this precious kerchief as a gift for him to wear on his bar mitzvah, not to give it away. Not to sully it. It had never been dirty before. And of course, there's a certain amount of trepidation that the narrator feels when starting chapter 13, when he goes home. When I reached the house, I walked around it on all four sides. Suddenly, I stopped at mother's window, the one from which she used to look out. The place was strange. The sun's light upon it did not dazzle, but warmed, and there was perfect rest there. 2 or 3 people passing slowed their paces and lowered their voices. One of them wiped his brow and sighed deeply. It seemed to me that sigh must still be hanging there. Okay, so you get an intimation in this return after the bar mitzvah from the way in which the mother is sitting by the window, which is how she's described whenever the father goes away on business. That she's sitting by the window and a tear is on her cheek, like Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple, who Jerusalem likened as if to a widow. And you have that same posture being reiterated here. You have these people being so quiet around the house. And you have the sense of, well, that's strange. This kid is coming home from his bar mitzvah. Why does this seem so quiet? Why is everyone so hushed? Why is the mom sitting by the window, which we already have been trained from earlier on the story to see as a mark of lament? What is she lamenting? Why are they not celebrating? And why are we getting this evocation of the father being out of town? Why would the father not be home for his son's bar mitzvah? Right? So you get an intimation very subtly. Again, this is also the hidden adult being able to suss this out, that the father may not be there because the father has died. And the father doesn't just stand for the father, lowercase f. Throughout the story, the father is likened in various respects to Avinu Shebashamayim, the heavenly father. And so there is a slight intimation that they are like the widowed, or as if widowed Jerusalem, that they have to act as if the father is not there. They no longer can assume that the father is going to step in and save the way the father saved him in the dream and from his own inability to act in the world. Now this boy, as he has attained majority, he really does have to fill the place of the father. And in that Zionist manner, to act in such a way, if I want to be very impious, I could read this as a slight indication that God is dead. But if I want to be less heretical, I can say that even with God alive, that the modern Zionist awareness is that we have to act on our own and not expect that divine intervention. And so against this background, the boy is scared that his mom's going to be mad at him. And he says, before I had a chance to ask her forgiveness, right? He thinks she's going to be mad at him. He sees she was looking at me with love and affection. And I too looked back at her with great joy as that Shabbat when my mother tied the kerchief to her head for the very first time. So what is the significance of the kerchief, this small thing in this story? The kerchief here is like the goat, the thing that has to be sacrificed or given away. But perhaps it's better not to call this as much as a sacrifice. Like there's no one that's being killed, no living creature whose blood is being shed for this. Rather, it's a domestic object or a sign of a certain kind of religiosity that is going to have to be repurposed for the life of action, the adult life of action to take place, right? So let me just summarize where we've come from and where I think we've landed in this triptych. Okay. And I'll preface that by quoting a remark that was made last week in my Jewish children's literature class, which I'm teaching for the first time at HUC. Where I hosted a famous children's writer named Gail Carson Levine. She's best known for having authored the book Ella Enchanted, for which she received a Newbery Medal. It was made into a Hollywood movie. She's written many, many books. Most recently, she's gotten more involved and interested in Jewish content. She published a book about the Spanish Inquisition from the point of view of a young girl called A Ceiling Made of Eggshells, and that's what we read in my class. And Gail Carson Levine concluded her talk by saying, I would like the wider population to understand how few Jews there are. The smallness and the preciousness of the Jews is not well known. All of these stories that we've looked at are about smallness. They're about little boys, in some cases, super small little boys, but that stand for something larger, which is to say the smallness, the minority status, but nevertheless the preciousness and the great attainment of the Jewish community. In the case of Rabbi Gadiel, we meet a Jew who's a little homunculus, right? A tiny man who's fated to use his talents and his wits and his secret tricks, and even to sacrifice himself in a high-stakes battle in order to fend off ever-present anti-Semitic aggressors. And so it's the small being pitted against the large, which is to say the Jew and the rest of the world, the Jew and Christianity. In the case of Maaseh HaEz, the tale of the goat, we have a suggestion that the threats are not just from the outside, from that majority Gentile world, but also from within the Jewish community, and in some cases, the larger Jewish community. And in order to survive, the young Zionists may have to cut themselves off from that larger community and even sacrifice their old world past via the symbol of the Gadi, the goat that tragically is slaughtered. In the kerchief, which blends the adult and the child perspective at the same time, so the dual address is really interwoven. We have a narrative bridge between the small and the large, between the old world and the new, insofar as the story is about parents and children, and it's meant as a lesson in responsibility for wealthy German Jews who are immigrating to Palestine just a year later, and they're going to become owners of a major, large media vehicle. And therefore, they are going to be responsible for helping build new forms of Zionist home and homemaking, and are going to need to understand what's going to have to happen, the kind of getting yourself dirty that's going to have to happen in the real world in order for this Zionist experiment to succeed. And however tiny the Jew is, or tiny the Jewish people is, or however tiny the future state of Israel is, that tiny entity will have to step into the world of action and do what it can, even giving up precious tokens of the past, in order to have its public, social, and moral impact to perfect the world. In giving away that kerchief, he's doing this tremendous chesed for this beggar who's associated ultimately with the idea of messianic redemption. And binding the sores of that beggar is just a small step in that journey. Any questions? I'm going to stop the share now.
Thank you, Dr. Zierler. We can take maybe one or two questions, but we went quite a bit over time. So if anybody does have to leave, you can, don't feel bad about going, because, but if anybody would like to ask a question or two, we'll stay for 5 or so more minutes. I'll ask one if nobody has. Does anybody have a question before I jump in? I was just curious about the title, that he's both a Rabbi and also a Tinok, right? Rabbi Gadiel HaTinok. It's kind of this like foil, like what was supposed to be communicated with that title?
But I think that it's meant to communicate the idea that of the seeming impossibility of someone so small, both in age and stature, having that kind of huge knowledge. That already from age 5. So he's meant to be a prodigy based on the story from the Yitzhak Luria Sefer, the Kabbalistic text that I referred to, where the Na'ar was 7 when he was already a prodigy and was martyred. That you have these exceptional cases like Yanukas that are able to attain such Rebbe status, Torah knowledge at such a young age. So I think that it's the extreme articulation of the small defeating the few defeating the many, the small defeating the large. This in children's literature, it's also part of the fantasy that the kids can do it on their own. In every good children's book, the key is to dispatch the adults to the wings so that kids can go and do something on their own. So calling him a Rebbe and also a Tinok at the same time is a way of conveying that message of the tremendous capacity of young people, filling them with a sense of independent spirit, even as it's imagining and inculcating values for their adulthood. Any more questions?
I have one more question just about the role of women, because we kind of touched upon it briefly. Did Agnon ever write any stories where women were the heroines or played more of an active role?
Not too many. I in fact am more than halfway through a book that is a comparative studies of stories by Agnon and his friend and contemporary Devorah Baron, who wrote in a similar midrashic vein about the old world, and often they wrote about the exact same themes. He started his career with the story Agunot, and she wrote a story called Aguna, and it's like a variation on the same theme, but where his story takes the image of an Aguna and uses it metaphorically and completely bypasses the woman's experience, being a chained widow, unable to get a divorce. And Baron responds to that by writing a story that actually fixes on the actual experiences of women. So for Agnon, often, He was a man of his time. The woman is secondary to the larger story. There are only a few exceptions. I mean, he wrote there was a posthumous novel called Shira about a nurse, where a woman plays a very important central role. And I could bring some other exceptions, but in many of these stories, I detected. Oh, and the other perhaps most famous and beloved story that Agnon wrote, where a woman is foregrounded, and in fact, it seems in that case, Baron had written an earlier version of this, and Agnon expanded upon it, is his novella Tehillah, which was published in 1952 about a pious woman of Jerusalem. And it's one of the most gorgeous stories that he ever wrote. So high praise for Agnon's Tehillah. And their Tehillah is basically standing for the beauty of Jerusalem. She's a metonymic representation of Old Yerushalayim.
Thank you. Very interesting. Any last questions before we sign off? Yeah, okay. So I just want to thank Dr. Zierler, Rabbi Dr. Zierler, so much for this wonderful presentation. And we will have a link to the recording. It'll be up on our YouTube channel. So please share this with your friends. And we hope to see you at future lectures. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.